This lecture is for class Shastri Part-2nd, Paper 1st. Today we will study about the famous poet P.B. Shelley's poem Ode to the West Wind. First of all, we will know about the poet. The poet P.B. Shelley was born on 4 August 1792 and died on 8 July 1822. He was born and raised in the English countryside in the village Broadbridge, Heath, just outside of West Sussex. He left home at age of 10 to study at Sion House Academy. After 2 years, he enrolled at Eton College. In 1810, Shelley entered University College, Oxford. Due to social opposition in March 1818, Shelley decided to leave England. The last 4 years of his life, 1818 to 1822, were spent mainly in Italy in occasional converts. He was one of the major English Romantic poets, widely regarded as one of the greatest lyric and philosophical poets in English language. He became a key member of a close circle of visionary poets and writers that included Byron, Keats, Hunt, and Peacock. Shelley's conventional life and uncompromising idealism combined with his strong disapproving voice made him an authoritative and much denigrated figure during his life and afterwards. It is known that Mahatma Gandhi would often quote Shelley's The Masque of Anarchy, which has been called perhaps the first modern statement of the principle of non-violent resistance. He was popular as a social reformer and prophet. He was a revolutionary. He did not believe in the customs and conventions of the world. He was little interested in the past. His eyes were fixed on the future. He was one of the supreme poets of love. Because of him, love is a transcendental force kindling all things into beauty. He was a nature poet and wrote some poems under the influence of Wordsworth. Unlike Wordsworth, he looked upon nature as well, heeding its refulgence and whose reality is only illumined at intervals by its momentary visits. His poetry sometimes had only an underground Shelley in 1819 near Florence, Italy. It was originally published in today. Thus we can say that Shelley is the great poet of hope just as Wordsworth is of wisdom. Then we come on the poem. First of all, we know about the poem. The poem Ode to the West Wind is an ode which was written by P.B. Shelley in 1819 near Florence, Italy. It was originally published in 1820 by Charles as part of collection Prometheus Unbound, a lyrical drama in 4 acts with other poems. Some also believe that the poem was written in response to the loss of his son William in 1819. The ensuing pain influenced Shelley. Perhaps more than anything else, Shelley wanted to convey his message of reform and revolution, and the west wind becomes the trope of spreading the word of change through the poet prophet figure. Then we come on the detailed study of the poem. This poem is divided into 5 cantos. Here is the first stanza of first canto. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanted fling. In the opening stanza of the poem Ode to the West Wind, the speaker appeals to the wild west wind. The use of capital letters for west and wind immediately suggests that he is speaking to the wind as though it were a person. He calls the wind the breath of autumn's being, thereby further personifying the wind and giving it the human quality of having breathed. He describes the wind as having unseen presence, which makes it seem as though he views the wind as a sort of god or spiritual being. The last line of this stanza specifically refers to the wind as a spiritual being that drives away death and ghost. Here is the second stanza of Canto First. Yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence striken multitudes, O thou who chariotest to their dark wintry bed. This stanza of Ode to the West Wind describes the dead autumn leaves. They are not described as colorful and beautiful, but rather as a symbol of death and even disease. The speaker describes the deathly colors yellow, black, and pale. Even hectic red reminds one of blood and sickness. He describes the dead and dying leaves as pestilence stricken multitudes. This is not a peaceful nor beautiful description of the fall leaves. Rather, the speaker seems to see the fall leaves as a symbol of the dead, the sick, and the dying. The wind then comes along like a chariot and carries the leaves to their dark wintry bed, which is clearly a symbol of a grave. Then we like a chariot and carries the leaves to their dark wintry bed, which is clearly a symbol of a grave. Then we come on the stanza third of Canto First. The winged seeds where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow. The speaker continues the metaphor of the leaves as the dead by explaining that the wind carries them and winged seeds to their graves where they lie cold and low. The poet then uses a simile to compare each leaf to a corpse within its grave. But then, part way through the second line, a shift occurs. The speaker says that each is like a corpse until the wind comes through, taking away the dead but bringing new life. The use of the word azure or blue to describe the wind is in sharp contrast to the colors used to describe the leaves. Here is the stanza fourth of Canto first. Her clarion over the dreaming earth and fill, driving sweet birds like flocks to feed in air, with living hue and odors plain and hill. With this stanza of Ode to the West Wind, the speaker describes the wind as something which drives away death, burying the dead, and bringing new life. It brings living hues and odors which are filled with new life. These are the last lines of Canto first. Wild spirit which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, here, oh here. So in these lines, the poet shows that west wind is a destroyer and a preserver on the earth. Here, the speaker again appeals to the wind, calling it a wild spirit and viewing it as a spiritual being who destroys and yet also preserves life. He is asking the Spirit to hear his pleas. He has not yet made a specific request of the wind, but it is clear that he views it as a powerful spiritual being which can hear him. Then we come on Canto second, and here is the first stanza of Canto second, in which the poet describes about the west wind in sky. Thou on whose stream mild the steep sky's commotion, loose clouds like earth's decaying leaves are set, shook from the tangled woes of heaven and ocean. Again the speaker addresses the wind as a person, calling it the one who will lose clouds and shake the leaves of the boughs of heaven and ocean. This reads almost as a psalm, as if the speaker is praising the wind for its power. Here is the second stanza of Canto second. Angels of rain and lightning, there are spread on the blue surface of thine airy surge, like the bright hair uplifted from the head. Again, the speaker refers to the wind as a spiritual being more powerful than angels. For the angels of rain and lightning are described as being spread on the blue surface of the wind. He then describes these angels as being like the bright hair on the head of an even greater being. Here is the stanza third of Canto second of some fierce maenad even from the dim verge of the horizon to the zenith's height, the locks of the approaching storm thou dirge. In this stanza of the west wind, the speaker compares the wind to a fierce maenad, or the spiritual being that used to be found around the Greek god Dionysus. Remember, this is the being that was also described as having hair like angels. Thus, the wind is described as a being like a god, with angels for hair. These angels of rain and lightning reveal that a storm is on the way. Here is the stanza 4 of Canto 2nd of the dying year, of which this closing night will be the doom of a vast sepulchre vaulted with all thy congregated might. The speaker then explains that the storm approaching is the impending doom of the dying year. The use of sepulchre is interesting too, since this is referred to a small room monument in which a person is buried in typically Christian origin. To refer to something like this would suggest that Shelley wants to trap and contain all the power of nature inside the tomb for it to burst open. Stanza 5. As well as this, a sepulchre is an isolating way of being buried, which could indicate Shelley wants to move away from all his miseries and be finally at one with nature. Here, these are the last lines of Canto 2nd of vapors from whose solid atmosphere black rain and fire and hell will burst. Oh, here. The speaker then describes the wind as the bringer of death. He has already described it as the destroyer. Here he describes it as one who brings black rain and fire and hell. Then, to end this canto, the speaker again appeals to the wind, begging that it would hear him. Then we come on canto 3rd and stanza 1st. Thou who didst waken from his summer dreams, the blue Mediterranean, where he lay lulled by the coil of his crystalline streams. In this canto, the poet describes the power of west wind in sea. To begin this canto, the speaker describes the wind as having woken up the Mediterranean Sea from a whole summer of peaceful rest. The sea here is also personified. Here is the second stanza of Canto 3rd. Beside a pumic isle in beige bay and saw in sleep old palaces and towers curing within the waves instead day. With this stanza of Ode to the West Wind, the speaker simply implies that the sea was dreaming of the old days and palaces and towers, and that he was querying at the memory of an inster day. This is the stanza 3rd of Canto 3rd. All overgrown with azure, moss and flowers, so sweet the sense faints, picturing them, thou for whose path the Atlantic's level powers. The speaker continues to describe the sea's dream as being of slower days when everything was overgrown with blue, moss, and flowers. Then he hints that something is about to change when he mentions to Atlantic's power. Then we come on the stanza 4 and 5 of Canto 3rd. Cleave themselves into chasm while the willow, the sea bloom, and the osier woods which wear the shapeless foliage of the ocean know. And here, these are the last two lines of Canto third. Thy voice and suddenly grow grey with fear and tremble and despoil themselves, O hear. This stanza of Ode to the West Wind is in reference to the sea's reaction to the power of the wind. At the first sign of the strong wind, the sea seems to cleave into chasm and grow grey with fear as they tremble at the power of the wind again. This stanza reflects a psalm in worship of a God so mighty that nature itself tremble in its sight.